All right, ready to dive into some murky waters today? We're tackling online harms. And judging by the stack of articles, studies, even personal stories you've sent in, it's clearly something you want to really get a grip on.
And it's a slippery one. People hear online harm and think, oh, nasty comments, right? But it goes way deeper. We're talking about the lasting damage of harassment, how misinformation spreads like wildfire,
Yeah.
even how these online spaces, designed for connection, can be twisted for harm.
It's true. And that Asia One article, the one about Clarissa, man, that one stayed with me, really drives home the point that this can happen to anyone.
Absolutely.
For those who haven't read it, Clarissa's a sales executive, reaches out to a senior colleague for advice. Seems harmless enough, right?
You think so, but the colleague's wife gets involved.
Yeah.
And that's where things go off the rails. She's convinced something else is going on and subjects this woman to 2 years of relentless online harassment.
2 years.
2 years. Even created fake profiles, used the names of Clarissa's actual colleagues so she'd accept the friend requests.
Yeah.
This stuff is insidious.
It makes you really think twice about what you put out there, you know? And that GetSafe online report, they get into the nitty-gritty of how cyberstalking works. It's scary stuff. Exploiting public information, hacking accounts to spread rumors. This isn't just celebrity drama, it's anyone's nightmare.
It's a stark reminder that we leave a digital trail, and we have to be mindful of who's following it. But yeah, online harms, it's a huge umbrella. Remember that NSPCC material?
Oh yeah, the stuff about how online spaces can worsen eating disorders.
Exactly. Those pro-ANA websites, for example, they don't just provide information. They actively encourage dangerous behavior.
And it's so easy to stumble across that stuff, especially if you're vulnerable, looking for support, and you end up in this echo chamber that just reinforces harmful thoughts.
Which brings us back to that point. Online platforms are tools. The Imperial College article nailed it. It's not about screen time. It's about how it's used. Any tool can be misused, right?
So we've got everything from personal attacks to the spread of dangerous ideologies, which begs the question, what do we do about it? How do you even begin to regulate something as massive and ever-changing as the internet?
Well, that's where the headaches start. The Singapore Law Gazette put it quite bluntly, they said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the current direction of regulation might be headed down the wrong path. Well, that Linklater's report shed some light on that. It seems like most countries outside of the U.S. are really leaning on this idea of intermediary liability. Basically, they're saying platforms are responsible for what their users post. You own the park, someone spray paints graffiti on the jungle gym, you're on the hook to clean it up, even if you didn't do it.
Makes sense in a way. So Facebook sees a harmful post, they don't take it down, they're in trouble.
Pretty much. And speaking of taking action, you mentioned Singapore's stepping up their game, right?
Yeah.
That new government agency to deal specifically with online harms.
Yeah, that's right. They're even offering a direct line for victims to report issues. Seems like a good move, having a clear point of contact.
Seems like it, but it's not a magic bullet. Nash's research, she brings up a good point, focusing solely on removing content might miss the forest for the trees. Think about it. Taking down a hateful post doesn't magically change the mind of the person who wrote it, right? Plus, defining harm in the online world, it's incredibly subjective. What's offensive to me might be someone else's idea of free speech.
So it's not as simple as playing whack-a-mole with every nasty tweet or disturbing image. We've got to address what's driving this behavior in the first place, but how?
Deleting content is just a band-aid. We need to understand the motivations behind online harm and look for solutions that actually address the root of the problem.
So we've established that just hitting delete isn't the answer. It's like treating the symptom, not the disease. But if we're not just weeding out bad content, what are we aiming for?
Well, some are trying to get ahead of it. That Decision Lab piece, the one about online gaming. Fascinating stuff.
Oh, right, the Optimus experiment.
That's the one. They basically started showing players these positive messages before their games. Little nudges in the right direction.
And it actually worked, didn't it? Like, just a sprinkle of good vibes, and suddenly there's less toxicity. Makes you wonder, could we do that on a larger scale? Subtly encourage healthier online behavior.
Wouldn't that be something? But, even with the best of intentions, things can backfire.
For sure. There's always a catch, right?
Right. The Nash report, she talks about this, how getting too aggressive with removing content, even certain types of content, it can actually harm the people we're trying to protect.
Really? How so?
Well, imagine a platform that bans any mention of self-harm, right? Sounds good on paper, maybe. But what about the people who find support in those communities? Sharing their struggles, finding others who get it.
Oh, I see what you mean. Like, You're trying to eliminate the trigger, but you're also cutting off a lifeline for some people.
Exactly. It's a tough needle to thread. And the thing is, vulnerability online, it's not limited to one group or another.
Right, like anyone can be susceptible, depending on what's going on in their life.
That LGA briefing you said, they made a good point about that.
Yeah.
Especially during sensitive times like elections, everyone's a bit more on edge, right?
Oh, tell me about it. Elections bring out the passionate side in a lot of people. And that's prime time for misinformation to spread.
Exactly. And that leads us to another layer of this whole thing. What does regulation mean for free speech, for democracy itself?
Ooh, okay. Now we're getting serious.
We are. Because think about it, that Imperial College article, they were saying that trying to control the flow of information too tightly, like with the UK's idea for an online regulator, it could do more harm than good.
Really?
Yeah, the argument is that instead of a safer online world, you end up with censorship, echo chambers.
Right.
People only seeing what confirms their existing biases.
So instead of making things better, we risk creating these online echo chambers where everyone's just shouting their own version of the truth.
That's the worry. And it highlights this fundamental tension. How do we protect people and protect online freedoms?
Sounds like a tightrope walk. We need to figure out how to keep people safe without turning the internet into some sanitized, censored version of itself.
Exactly. And here's the kicker. Online harms don't care about borders, right? This is a global issue, and every country is grappling with it in their own way.
It really highlights how global this whole thing is. Like, no easy answers, just a bunch of different countries trying to figure out their own approach. It's like a big digital jigsaw puzzle. Everyone's got a different piece.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of different pieces, that Linklaters report does a good job of outlining those different approaches. Take Australia, for example. They're not messing around with their Online Safety Act. They've got a commissioner who can literally issue takedown orders to platforms hosting harmful content.
Wow, talk about cutting to the chase. Sounds like they're all about swift action. What about other parts of the world? How are they tackling this?
Well, the European Union is taking a slightly different approach with their Digital Services Act. Their focus is more on holding platforms accountable for those big picture risks.
Big picture risks, like what?
Like the spread of disinformation, those systemic issues. It's less about individual posts and more about the overall environment a platform creates.
So different strokes for different folks. And of course, we can't forget about Singapore. They've been pretty proactive on this front.
Definitely. That new agency they're setting up, the one specifically designed to handle online harms, that's a prime example. Remember we were talking about that direct line for victims to report issues?
Yeah, it sounds like a good idea in theory.
It is. And they're taking it a step further. They're actually planning to have dedicated points of contact within platforms like Meta and Google. So if someone in Singapore has an issue, they can potentially go directly to the source, so to speak.
Interesting. So with all these different approaches popping up, do you think there's a one-size-fits-all solution, or is it always going to be about finding what works best for each individual country and context?
And I honestly don't think there's a simple answer. You've got to consider cultural differences, legal systems, societal priorities. What flies in one country might not even get off the ground in another.
True, true. But let's zoom back in on Singapore for a second. This new agency, the direct reporting, it sounds promising. But I can't help but wonder, is this just shifting the burden from the legal system onto this new agency?
It's a valid concern. And that Singapore Law Watch piece brought up another interesting angle. Even with this new agency, those existing laws, like the Online Criminal Harms Act and the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act, they're still in play.
So you've got all these different regulations potentially overlapping, maybe even contradicting each other.
Exactly. It gets complicated quickly. And it highlights the fact that even with the best intentions, it's easy to make things more confusing.
It's like they say, too many cooks in the kitchen can spoil the broth.
Right. And we can't forget about those unintended consequences we were discussing earlier. Nash's research really drove that point home, that even well-intentioned regulations can backfire.
Stifling free speech, creating those echo chamber effects.
Exactly. Even hindering innovation in the tech sector. It's a delicate balancing act, that's for sure.
So, where does this leave us? Are we doomed to be stuck in this tug of war between wanting to protect users and wanting to preserve online freedoms?
It's not about being stuck, but about acknowledging the complexity. This isn't a simple case of good versus bad. Regulating online harms requires careful thought, a deep understanding of all the nuances, and a willingness to adapt as the digital landscape evolves.
Well said. You've given us a lot to chew on today. Any final thoughts for our listeners out there as they try to navigate this complicated world of online harms?
Here's something to ponder. As we work towards a safer online world, are we even inadvertently pushing vulnerable individuals further into the shadows? By focusing so heavily on content moderation and holding platforms accountable, are we neglecting the underlying social and psychological factors that contribute to these harms in the first place? That's a question worth considering.
It really is. It's like we're so busy treating the symptoms that we forget to address the underlying cause. Lots to think about. Well, that's all the time we have for today's deep dive into the world of online harms. We hope this conversation has given you a better understanding of this complex and constantly evolving issue. Remember, knowledge is power. By staying informed, engaging in thoughtful discussions, and advocating for a safer, more inclusive online experience, we can all play a part in shaping the future of the digital world. Until next time.